got no we've got no time limits or rush on anything. So just as long as the conversation's going, it's good with me.
Okay. All right, we're live. Cool.
Sweet.
Hey everyone, Tyler, teach here at UT. If you haven't had any classes with me, I'm at the AET side of things. Um, but I have with me here Scott Anderson, who I've known through various conferences, meetings, stuff like that, um, for probably like 8, 9 years since
Yeah,
like
it's
IndieCade
been a
stuff.
while.
So I asked him to come chat with us. Scott's currently at Unity. I'll let him kind of talk more about all the places he's been and the cool stuff he's done. So I'm going to ask a bunch of questions to him. We're just going to have a good chat, and then we'll open it up to questions from y'all as well. And if you have a question that's relevant at the moment of our topic, feel free to toss it out either here in the Zoom or in Twitch, and we'll try to work it into the conversation. And if not, we'll kind of circle back around after. So Scott, take it away. Tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Scott, as as mentioned by Tyler. Thank you for having me. I am currently a graphics engineer at Unity on a team called Spotlight. So Spotlight team works with other like third-party game developers, because like probably as like a lot of you know, maybe not all of you know, Unity doesn't exactly make games in-house, right? Unity has demo teams that make small kind of like tutorial projects, or like bigger demos that happen around Unite that kind of showcase the engine, right? Like I think Adam was one of them. A lot of the time they're non-interactive. They're just like rendering literally tech demos, right? So, but we don't have like a game team that's making a big game that consumers are actively playing, right? So the Spotlight team was kind of founded to work with third-party developers, kind of partially or fully embed with those teams, and help them kind of get through challenges working with the engine or building new features that, like, especially we tend to work with larger games, and teams that would be considered AAA or like double A, like high end, larger than your average indie team that kind of works with Unity. So a lot of it is like figuring out what they're doing, helping them kind of fix issues or do things that they couldn't normally do in Unity without new features or new support, and also try and get those back into the mainline engine, right? So everyone can use them if it's relevant. So,
and are you working with specific areas of expertise in this, or is it kind of the idea that you're a generalist and know your way around the whole engine?
it's a little bit of both. Like I've been focused on DOTS recently, with which DOTS, if you're not aware of it, is data-oriented tech stack. So it's kind of a new way of doing things in Unity that's been in development, I think, for a few years now. It's still in preview. It's still relatively early. It changes the paradigm of Unity a lot, right? There's a little bit of there's a newer. It's not new exactly, but there's a newer programming paradigm that's gaining a lot of traction with newer game engines called ECS, which is Entity Component System, and it's more data oriented than like the more traditional, if you call it that, object oriented game development workflow, right? So like you all are probably familiar with object oriented in the sense of that, like, you have a game object, the game object kind of mixes code and data. With ECS, it switches a little bit where they're entities, and entities are basically just an ID or a key. And entities have a bunch of associated data, right? So and then there's no class or object specifically associated with an entity, right? But there are what are called systems in ECS. So that's the S in the in the ECS, right? And systems actually run code and modify data, right? And the systems do filtering and matching based off of what components actually exist on the entity. So instead of having, let's say, a player, I mean, you might have a player entity for various reasons, right? Where you want to tag it as a player because you want specific behavior on a player. But instead of having like a monolithic player game object, or even like a set of components that are object oriented that have fixed behavior, you say like, oh, anything with like, the player tag or like player and a velocity tag has this behavior, right? So you look at the data on the specific associated with the specific entities, and your code runs based on the data that the thing contains, not the code that's tied to a class. So it's like not as type oriented as
Yeah.
a system.
I think I've always misunderstood ECS in that I've always assumed Unity just by using it is an ECS because it's such like a component-based structure. But there is kind of the idea of component-based architecture separate from the ECS, which is like a full paradigm.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I actually honestly understand the complete difference. So thank you for explaining that.
Yeah. Yeah, the major difference there is components in Unity on a game object are ways to kind of reuse code. But in practice, that thing still operates as like a game object still operates as like a unified class, right? You can just kind of move them around, right? And Unreal Engine operates in a similar way in a lot of ways, right? Where you still have like you have an actor class with a set of components, right?
Yeah.
But there are no systems, right? So that's kind of the major part, right? Where the behavior, the update, your trigger enters, etc., are all on your component, right?
Sure.
Versus being in a completely separate system that's just matching data and modifying the data based on what exists and what doesn't exist.
Yeah. In your time game programming, how many times do you think you've had to deal with a sort of like architecture or paradigm shift like this?
That's a good question. Not much actually, which is interesting, but like, I guess I haven't talked about how long I've been in the industry. I've been like, my first real industry job was in 2007. So I guess that's 14 years now working on games. But before that, I spent a couple years working on non-game kind of software, like for mobile devices primarily, mostly UI stuff.
Yeah.
So, most of that time has been relatively object oriented. I've like a lot of the projects I've worked on have been on Unreal Engine. I guess when I worked on Call of Duty, it's a little bit different. Call of Duty is a little bit different in the sense of like, the Call of Duty code base I worked on was not very object oriented. Actually, it was very like kind of close to ANSI C++, which meant it was more like, if you look at older id Tech engines, which are all open source, right? Like Quake 3,
Yeah.
which is kind of the basis of Call of Duty, right? But also just any of the Quake engines, the original Quake engines, they're written in this style that is more, I guess, procedural, you would call it, right? Where there's no classes or anything in C. So like, and that was fun to program in. Actually, it was like relatively straightforward compared to some of the other code bases that I worked in. But yeah.
While we're on the Wayback Machine, so yeah, you've been doing game stuff since 2007, 2008. You've got a whole ton of different places, right? I mean, you've done indie, you've been at some of the largest companies in the world. You've been on like every side of this. I'm gonna kind of pick on a couple of those as we chat, but I'd be wondering for you, like Scott coming right out of college, right? Scott coming right into games. What was your like expectation versus reality, kind of looking back at that now? Were there any certain like misconceptions you had either about the industry or about particular jobs that like I wish I would have known when I just got out of college, or, when I first got my first roles here in like doing games?
It's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question. There weren't, I actually coming into, like, when I first got my first job in games, I didn't have a ton of misconceptions about how things were done or like what was there. Like, obviously I learned a lot. There were just things that I had like gaps in, right, in terms of the way games are written or games are architected, right? But part of that comes from also like, you know, by the time I started in games, I had been like writing software professionally on and off since I was 16, like in internships and like, you know, or that earlier job that I mentioned, right? So I had a little bit of knowledge of like what it would be like to just sit down and write code, you know, on a team with a group of people. Um, uh, you know, I think like I had also done part-time indie development before that, so I had a good idea of like at least a certain idea of how the games business work, industry business side worked, and like how games are made, kind of, right? Like at least on a smaller scale. So there weren't a ton of surprises, right? I knew that crunch could be a thing at that point. Um, you know, I guess like, you know, when we're talking about my first job at Cheyenne Mountain Entertainment, it was a startup that was working on a game called Stargate Worlds. It's based off the Stargate TV show. And you know, it wasn't really run in a great way. And eventually, you know, we kind of got like into bank glitches, which means we didn't get paychecks, or we got late paychecks for a long period of time, right? And you know, eventually, like a lot of people just started leaving from the company. So I guess one lesson I learned was just the amount of volatility in the industry, and like I had some idea, like before that even, because you know, when I was looking around for jobs and games and interviewing and you know, for that job, but also for other jobs, you know, I applied to studios that I didn't get calls back, and then I saw like they were shutting down, you know, a couple months later, right? So, like, especially in that time, because that was around the PS3, Xbox 360 transition, which hurt a lot of studios, right? Because production values went up a lot, right? And like, I think now we're at a point where like a lot of the studios that can't actually produce a AAA game are just gone, or they're doing other things, right? Like there's a lot more space in the middle in like indie realm or like mid-tier,
that was
right?
the death of AA, as they called it.
Yeah. So, but like, then there were a lot of teams that were like, oh, we have to be, you know, AAA and doing these big productions, but they couldn't really scale quickly enough to it, both their tech and like, you know, just their processes and, you know, a lot of things like, right, their skill set. So, yeah.
Do you feel like your experiences at Cheyenne, did you get any of the like recognize any of those yellow flags at 38?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. Okay.
So actually, like 2 weeks before 38 shut down, I had a one-on-one with my boss at the time, my manager at the time, and like him and I are still like you know, pretty good friends, right? Like I made a lot of really good connections at 38 Studios. So like I wasn't there very long, but like I'm still friends with a lot of people there. And coworkers now in some cases, like some of them are at Unity now. But like I asked him, because they kept having investor meetings and stuff and giving us updates, and they're like, well, we don't know what's going to happen. I'm like, are we shutting down? What's going on? Like, I just asked him point blank, and he's like, I haven't heard anything. So like, and then we shut down. So yeah, I recognize the flags. Like, you know, it's people, I think pretty high up at that point weren't really communicated what was going on.
Yeah.
And I've seen that pattern happen a couple of times, because this happens in startups in general. It's not just in gaming. But what happens is there'll be multiple times where it looks like for founders or for our, you know, executives in the company or people that are thinking about money, right, in general, there's often multiple events where it's like, oh, it looks like we only have like 2 weeks of runway. Like, what are we going to do? And then they scramble and they get investors in at the last minute, and it saves the day. And a lot of the companies that are producing games, this happened at Cheyenne as well, the day would always get saved, right, until it isn't, right? So they wouldn't tell anyone because they didn't want employee morale to sink, right? But like, you know, I don't know. And it happens elsewhere. Like it's common, right? Like a lot of the time, people don't know this is going to happen within the studio. But yeah, it's
Do you
it's
feel
kind of a shame.
like kind of silver lining? Were you able to walk away from those experiences with any sort of like, you know, this sucks, but at least blank? Like, I mean, you said you met a lot of people and you're still friends with them. So like, you work on something for a year, game either at least with 38 game came out, but like, is there silver lining? Is there something that you can at least say like, it sucks and it happens, but hey, I learned cool things. I met new friends. I learned never to get burned again.
I shouldn't say I learned never to get burned again.
Yeah. knock on the wall. Yeah.
But yeah, I did work on cool things and I met new friends that are, you know, I'm still friends with to this day. Like, you know, it's still like you work with people. There are a lot of good people at these studios, even if the studios had issues, right? Oh yeah, one thing about 38, the project I worked on actually didn't ship because
no.
I worked on the MMO, not Kingdoms of Amalur. There was a different team that, and some people had crossover in the studio, but it was very few. So, and I was not one of them. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely value in terms of network, and like, you know, people I met, and like, you know, with 38, I actually went there because I had worked previously with the manager, like when I worked on Homefront with Chaos Studios, right? So like, as studios rise and fall a lot, and if you have a decent reputation in the industry, like as you see things rise and fall, people reach out to you, and like so it helps a lot with opportunities or just like knowledge in the industry, like so I think. And you know, skill set also, right? You'll do things and learn things while you're there, right? Even if the project doesn't ship.
Sure.
Like obviously, it's better to ship a project even if it's not great, right? Than to not, right? That's also one thing that I've kind of learned over the years, where it's like, you know, like Shadow Physics, we probably should have just shipped it, right? Like even if it wasn't the best indie game ever, right? Like we probably should have just shipped it. Like it wasn't too bad.
Yeah, I mean, it was shown at quite a few events.
Yeah,
I remember seeing it at, I think, EGaDS or something. Probably GDC, I don't know, somewhere. But yeah.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, those were really early versions that were shown. I don't think like there's not really that much of the later versions out there. Like I took some footage, which I can actually share it in the chat later, or Discord or whatever. But I took some footage because I'm like, oh yeah, I'm probably one of the only people that still has like a build that runs reliably. And you know, there's not that much footage, right? Like the failure workshop talk that I gave at GDC like 9 years ago also had some footage too of the later builds, right? But yeah, even the early stuff that people played or saw like was pretty appealing. So yeah, I think that's like, you know,
at least with an indie, like the failure workshop, I think one of the things that you can get a good takeaway from is that when indies fail, there's a lot more personal experiences and life lessons. Whereas like when 38 Studios fails, like it's so far beyond you or out of your hands personally. Like, I don't know. I think there's positives and negatives to that, because you definitely feel the brunt of it as an indie not succeeding with something. You know, you can't blame it on anyone else. You can't really point the finger as well because it's a team of 6, team of 3, you know, team of whatever. But at least that control means like you can see the failure coming sometimes. I don't know. Thoughts on that? The failing from like so big it's out of your hands versus like it's a small team and like what could I have done differently?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a difference definitely in the sense of like there's nothing I could have done to change what happened with 38, right? With you know, I can see that, like I said, I could see the signs. I could be like, oh, the studio's probably going to shut down. I should be looking for a new job right now, you know, or not, or whatever. Like, you know, it depends on financial situation and a lot of other factors, right? But yeah, I think with Shadow Physics, like I saw signs also, but you know, there was always the option of just like kind of powering through it, right? Like it could have been, you know, you can kind of decide to burn yourself out more. Like, I mean, obviously some people, I shouldn't say you can, because a lot of people don't have the level of privilege required to do that, right? Like it's impossible. They will literally be on the street and then they won't be able to plug in their laptop, so they can't work on the game, right? Like that there's that level of like, this indie game could completely ruin you or your family or whatever, right? At the time for me, like I could have like figured out various things to continue, but like the cost of that was not, the cost benefit equation was not right at the time. So yeah.
I want to move the topic to something a little more positive. So you talked about before, like once you have a bit of a reputation, right, bouncing around from place to place becomes a lot easier. So especially for students, you know, looking to kind of break out in their first job, do you have any thoughts on like what is good networking, right? Like what makes for those strong connections that you're still talking to people from, you know, Cheyenne Mountain or from, you know, your time in Arizona? Like what were the kind of core tenets of the people you met that stuck with you that became that network that you still work upon?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like to me, a lot of it happened somewhat organically, right? In the sense of like, you know, I think, you know, just doing good work and not being a terrible person helps, right? Sure. Like, you know, and terrible person is kind of nebulous, right? And whatever, right? So, you know, but like, you know, obviously not, you know, insulting someone or being like abusive or, you know, those sort of things, right? Helps. But like, you know, I think like it's also like, you know, friendships are kind of organic also, right? So in the cases where they're kind of just become like friendships, you know, it could just be personal shared interest. It could be like, you know, in AAA, like, you know, I've worked in and out of indie, right? So in AAA, like some people are like, oh, you did some indie stuff. That's cool. Like, let's talk about indie stuff because they're still interested in it, right? That's one example, right? So like, and that's kind of just like building connections at work. Like obviously people that work more adjacent to you, you'll have closer connections than someone that works across the studio in a completely different department that you rarely interface with, right? So like that's kind of organic also, and it just happens. And that's not to say like most of the people that I have closer connections with are programmers. That's not true at all, because games are, as we know, multidisciplinary. But like, you know, if I happen to work like with a UI artist, right, when I was doing UI, like we're going to work a lot more, or a technical artist when I'm doing graphics for him, right, we're going to work a lot more closely than like, you know, if I'm not doing audio, like I may not interface with, you know, sound designers or the audio programmer at all, or very, very little, right? So, and in smaller studios, you obviously, like when I was at Phenomena, like everyone would interface with everyone, even across teams, because we were so small, right? So like what Tom team and Luna team would interface with each other very often because it's just a small studio. So yeah, I feel like they come across organically. There's another type of networking which actually is more intentional, which has helped me through various things also, like including like, you know, opportunities, start projects with people, etc. And it's more around like conferences or going to game jams or things like that. And that's more intentional, right? You have to like reach out to people. And my advice there, my only advice there actually is, I mean, I guess I could have more than just one thing, but if I was going to give one piece of advice there, it's like, don't really write off people just because they haven't done anything yet, right? Like, you know, I love like just talking to students actually at like GDC and stuff, right? Still, and like, you know, just random people, you know, and like, you know, there may not be no connection there. You might not see them again or whatever, but like, you also never know where someone's going to be. and like what kind of opportunities it might bring you. For example, I'm here talking to you guys because I met Tyler years ago and we just randomly chatted, right? Like, so like, you know, I think not all of those are going to bear fruit, but like things don't have to bear fruit to be valuable, right? Like, you know, I like to just talk to people about games and technology in general. So like, to me, just having a good conversation with someone is valuable.
Do you have any folks from like your original college years that you still keep in touch with?
Yeah, I have a couple. You know, I went to University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I was just in the CS program. This was before, like, I was in school. When did I start school? 2001. So 20 years ago is when I started college, roughly. I guess it was like the summer. So like, you know, 20 and a half years or whatever.
I can see the pain in your eyes, the sudden realization of, oh, geez.
Yeah. It's not a sudden realization. It's every time I say it, I'm like, wow,
Yeah.
that was a while ago. But like there were game design programs, definitely, but they weren't. It was funny because I felt like 4 or 5 years later, and I'm actually a dropout, so I never graduated. I dropped out like my junior year, but like 4 or 5 years after I entered, like suddenly like there was a massive proliferation of game development programs.
Yeah.
Like mid 2000s, it really started to come up.
And now was Deep Silver there at that time? Volition
was there, yes. Yeah, and a lot of people did get hired from that school into Volition, right? So I actually didn't interface with them at all when I was there. Like it was very separate, right? Maybe they gave a talk or something. Like we in the CS department, we did have some talks and stuff from people, and they might have given one. Like someone from Volition maybe gave one when I was there. The talk that I remember the most when I was there was Alexei Pajitnov came, creator of Tetris, right? And that was a really good talk. That's like one of my top game design talks still, probably. But
You're telling me I got to step up my game.
Yeah, I like keep in touch. It's kind of like I wandered off from there into a question a little bit, but like I keep in touch with some people there, but none of them are in games, right? So I actually don't know anyone in games from school. There's some people that briefly flirted with games. Like I was working with one guy that actually, if you've seen the original Shadow Physics video, right? I met that guy that recorded that video. It's just my laptop, right? Like like he had like a camera with him at GDC. I met him in school. I haven't seen him for years though. There's another person that we worked with, and like I was working on some early indie titles then, and they ended up kind of like I had a falling out for various reasons with them at that time, and they ended up actually like making Mafia Wars, the original Mafia Wars, and selling it to Zynga. So the guy became like, you know, there's like a big exit, and they made a ton of cash. But like, like I haven't really talked to them. Like occasionally I talk to the other guy. He's like a startup dude, but yeah, most of them aren't in games. But I still have connections with some of those people.
Yeah. So it seems like, I mean, most of your game connections came from that early Cheyenne, then on to Sledgehammer and 38 and stuff.
Yeah, early Cheyenne. A little bit before that, in the sense of there's some people that I knew from like early Chicago indie scene, because I'm from Chicago initially, so I was like in Chicago, and it was like really early indie scene, like 2006 era, where things were a lot different. Like people were mostly making like casual PC downloadable games, because that was really like Real Arcade and stuff like that. If anyone knows what the Big Fish, I guess, is still around. So Big Fish was another one, right? And I worked on a game called Boxen with a guy that I met in college. That I still keep. He's one of the people that I still keep in touch with. So we actually did develop games together, but that was all part-time, and he's never worked in the game industry formally. So that was like, you know, I keep in touch with some people there, and also I've been going to GDC since 2004, and there are people that I met there that I still keep in touch with, like that first GDC. Like,
Yeah.
are have any of you played Maquette at all? It's a new Annapurna puzzle game. It's like a recursive game. Anyway, the creator of Maquette, Hanford, he's like, I've known him since that first GDC, and I was a 20-year-old kid. Like, this is an example, right? Like, I was a 20-year-old kid. I had just dropped out of school like a couple months before that, right?
Yeah.
And it was my first GDC, and I meet this guy who's working on indie games also, and like we have a 17-year relationship now. Like, I'm in the credits of the game, right? As a special thanks, right? Like, he said Shadow Physics helped kind of inspire him to want to build this game. So, like, yeah, it's like a strong connection that just happened from like random, like a senior person, right? Before that, he had worked at LucasArts. He worked on Jedi Knight. Like, he shipped a couple indie games, right? So, he worked on like Netflix early UI and like Google TV and a lot of stuff like that, right? So it's a much more senior person talks to a junior person. Years later, that more junior person who's in school or just out of school, like inspired them to do something that became like a defining moment in their career, right? Like, so it's just like random connections like that, like cyclical things, right?
Yeah.
That once again, you never know, like in a 20-year span, you never know where people are going to be and like how they'll,
for sure,
if you work with them, if you'll whatever. Yeah,
I'd love to jump over to another topic. So I mentioned this before we started. Scott has this absolutely amazing link to all of the various prototypes he's made in the past 10 years. And it's great because it's a Twitter thread. So highly recommend to all y'all listening. You should do this, post all of the game jams, all the cool stuff you've made. So I'd love to hear you talk about some of those prototypes, Scott. I'd be willing to bet you probably had a similar vibe that I've had, where like you get that feeling of like, man, I haven't really done any stuff for myself or weird, interesting things. But then when you actually look at that back catalog, it's like, oh, there's a lot more that I almost completely forgot about. And like, look, all these weird little things I made that didn't lead to anywhere, but maybe they did because they changed you or like changed kind of your thoughts on games. So I'd love for you to just talk about prototypes, right? Like any in particular that you kind of can look back at and remember particular experiences from, just a general like prototyping, what it means to you.
Yeah. So it means a lot to me. Like, I don't have as much time as I'd like to do it, honestly, right now. And that's one of the reasons why I did that thread. So like after I left Facebook, like, I was like slightly burnt out by the experience. So just because of Facebook culture things and being reorged a lot and stuff like that, right? So I was like, oh, well, I haven't done a lot of prototypes, but I've done all these prototypes. I've never shared like a lot of them, right? Like, and that's, I think the beginning of the thread is that, right? So like, let me just share this stuff and get it out there. And like you said, it was kind of like a thing where it's like, I kind of need to celebrate some of the work that I've done, even if it's just random things that like were entertaining to me and no one saw or played, right? Like, I need to look back at that for myself, right? So I think prototyping is good. Like, I've done all these prototypes, right? Like, I actually cataloged every single prototype I've done ever. Like, I've written it down. I have it written down. I want to do another follow-up thread to this, and I haven't got around to doing it, but I want to do a follow-up thread that's like not just the 2010s prototype, but the 2000s prototypes, which like go back to the first Ludum Dare 48-hour competition, and like I was like 18 or something, right? Like, so I'm like, it's like 20 years of prototypes basically, like, and game jam stuff. But I think Shadow Physics is probably really the only thing that really turned into anything out of all those, right? And it's like 60. In that thread, I think there's like 30 or something, but like there's probably like 50 or 60 total, right? But like, yeah, I learned lessons from all of them. They were good ways to build up skills. Let's see, ones that I'm particularly fond of, like even though it's completely unfinished, I really like I Was in the War, which is like the little like shooter thing. It was supposed to be a narrative game. It's kind of like a Contra type thing. It was a flash game, so it's like unplayable now for almost everyone. uh, but um, that one was, I worked on it for a while, probably longer than I wanted to, but like it did like, it was interesting in the sense of like it was post shadow physics, and during shadow physics, like there was a lot of like back and forth about game feel, right? And like, oh, why doesn't the game feel good? Like it was a big concern of some of the investors, it was a big concern of the designer, right? And so I started learning a lot about platformer game feel, and like things improved a lot in shadow physics. They didn't quite get 100% or whatever, but like it got to a point where it wasn't too bad. But like with I Was in the War, it's like, oh, let me just do like the shooter thing, right? And like I actually worked on another one, and this isn't in this thread, but because it's like in 2007 with this game with a friend of mine uh, who lives in Austin actually now, but we were working on a game called Corpus, which was kind of a prototype, and it was like a run and gun shooter, and it felt okay too, right? But I was like, oh, let me do a new one. So I like it because like, even though I didn't finish the narrative, I didn't finish like the level design part, I built a lot, like I built a really good feeling game, I felt like, in terms of the shooting mechanics and stuff, and the feedback and the juiciness. So I was just proud of like applying those lessons I learned to a thing, even if it didn't get quite finished. See, another one, which I've been meaning to finish actually, and like redo. I've done like 3 redos of it, and none of them finished. But like, it's a game. I think it's called. It has a really generic name. It's called Push, and it's kind of like a single screen roguelike, and it was going to be a mobile roguelike where you could like kind of pull back and like release blocks, and you were like move, like it's just a grid based kind of roguelike thing, right? And actually from that thread, I was inspired to like try and redo it, and I never got a chance to. I haven't had a chance to like do that, but like people were kind of inspired by the slam mechanic and like the look and feel of it. So I was like, oh, let me just do like a wrestling roguelike where you're in an arena called Slam Night. So there's certain things that I want to revisit actually there too, that I liked, and they were kind of like finished, but not quite. Like either they're too buggy or whatever. But yeah, I think another one, Alien Falcon, which is still it's not really fun game. It's actually one of the few that has a playable link, I think, on there. That's not a Flash game also. It's a Unity download because it was done in the era of the Unity web player, which is this is another lesson. So when I started writing these up, I was like, okay, like, thinking about maintaining projects and keeping them runnable for a long period of time is actually very challenging, right? Like we live in an era where it's really easy to get like a game engine and like start building something, right? But like we also live in an era where like for various reasons, good and bad, tech gets deprecated all the time, and it's just completely unrunnable on large portions of systems, right? And like it's basically trash, right? Like you can't really ship a Flash game now, right? And Flash was such a foundational tool for indies, right, in a lot of ways, right? And it's just like obviously there's preservation and there's stuff, and it's like let's keep the history of it, but it's like it's kind of weird where it's like if you want to think like, oh, I actually want to, and prototypes are kind of throwaway, so you could be just like, no, I don't care, I'm just going to make this thing in the moment and get rid of it. But if you actually start thinking about like, oh, I want my prototype or my game to have longevity, like keeping that longevity across versions of Unity or across versions of Unreal or across versions of like tech that may disappear, right? Across browsers, if you make versions, if you make a web game and you don't actively maintain it, is like kind of a hard problem, right? In a lot of ways, it's we think a lot about portability in terms of like you can target all the platforms of the day in the moment you want to ship, but we don't really think about portability through into the future and like preservation and stuff. So this actually made me think about it a little bit, right? And like, you know, I was surprised how much stuff just ran still. Like Windows is actually really good about running really, really old stuff. Mac OS not as much, but
Yeah,
like,
and then browser base is where you
yeah,
lose support within weeks. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
I mean, the game still runs, and it was made in like Unity. I think it was made Unity 4 or like maybe even pre-Unity 4, like really old version, like 2010 version of
Yeah.
Unity, right? So and it's not a good game, but it was really fun to make, and it was my first global game jam. So and my first like real Unity game also even. So
how much of these prototypes do you feel that you were doing for just the exploratory process for funsies versus like you had a particular goal of like, I want to learn this tool, I want to learn this like engineering concept? Like, is it a mix of the two with each prototype, or is it like this one was for fun, this one was to learn, you know, a VR tool or something like that?
yeah, it's definitely a mix. I think like some of the VR stuff is definitely there for just like, let me see what it's like to set up a Unity project for VR, right? Like, or like even just like, because VR, you know, since VR interaction is such a different paradigm, and like especially like, you know, when you talk about like mid 2010s, like you talk about like anywhere from you know, I think the first larger VR prototype I did, that was actually targeted at VR is on there. It's a game called like Super Headball, which is like a really silly concept, and it was made for like Oculus DK1. So there weren't any like controllers, tracked controllers. It was only 3 degrees of freedom, right? So like I was like, okay, what can you do with an accelerometer? So I made like a game where you can, you know, move your head and roll, like you're in the maze on the accelerometer maze, roll the ball through the maze game, right? And that was really just like, let me just do something quick. It's kind of fun. I can learn about VR a little bit and setting up a VR project, and like explore VR paradigms a little bit, right? Other things I did actually have like a concept that I wanted to build out, and like, you know, like a high level game design concept of some sort, right? And it's like, let me make a small game, which also, this is good lessons. Like if you think you're making a small game, especially in a part-time project with no goals by solo, like it's always almost too big, because you'll either lose interest in it, or like the code will be a mess and you'll like lose track of it, or you actually like
You'll scope creep yourself to
you
death.
scope creep. Yeah, you scope creep where you don't know where it's going. Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's a good lesson learned. But like I think for like I was in the war, for example, to bring back to that one, it's like I actually had like a concept that came from a conversation, and it's like, oh well, I want to do this high concept thing, and I think I can do it small, but it's like it actually turned out being too big. So you know, and other things, like I think one of the last ones, I think there are a couple that are pure tech demos, right? There's like a couple Pico 8 games, which is just like literally me messing around in Pico 8 because I like to code in Pico 8, and I had no goals whatsoever and no agenda, right? It's like, or like I had agenda and it was purely tech driven, right? Where it's like there's a shooter that's a raycast shooter, and I read the highly recommended books, by the way. There's a book called the Wolfenstein Black Book, and there's a book called the Doom Black Book, that kind of go around they're like technical game history books where they talk about, they both do like a code review, but they also talk about the business climate and the hardware development and the game design and the, you know, team dynamics of like id Software, because it happens to be id, right? Like around why they built these games. It's like really comprehensive in terms of like how the tech works, but like why the tech works the way it does, and like how all these things fit together. There aren't many other books like this, right? I think there should be a lot more, right? That talk about different genres or different particular games, you know, both from a technical standpoint and like an art standpoint and just a production standpoint and a business standpoint, but really highly recommended. So I read the Wolfenstein book and I was like, oh, I should do a raycast thing because it'd be fun.
Yeah.
And I'll do it in Pico 8. So I just did it.
Did you do the fast inverse in Pico 8?
No, no.
I don't think you can even do that on Lua. Maybe shifting.
There's
Anyway,
they added Pico 8 does have bit operations. I think it has
Yeah.
its own, because Pico 8's like a slightly weird version of Lua that has
Yeah.
that requires like a custom preparser to parse it.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're
Well, it
writing a
uses-
Pico 8,
does it use LuaJIT?
it does not. I don't believe it uses LuaJIT. I'm not sure though. I don't believe it used LuaJIT. Pico 8's weird also because it uses the Lua debug stuff to create fake performance bottlenecks, right? So it's not just like raw Lua, right?
Yeah.
The Pico 8 Fantasy console has certain performance
Literally
characteristics.
throttles itself.
So it throttles itself based on certain operations. Certain operations have a certain cost, right? And it'll actually throttle your frame rate. So like,
Yeah.
you know, you probably could write like, given the resolution that Pico 8's in, especially if it was LuaJIT, you probably could write like a performant ray tracer, real-time ray tracer with a certain amount of objects or whatever, or like a ray marcher in Pico 8. But in practice, because of the throttling, that's like actually impossible to do. But like obviously people do 3D engines and they do all kinds of weird stuff. So
I want to dive into one of the other topics before we run out of time, which is all things VR. I think we've kind of touched on two important topics of VR: prototyping, just to learn the way around it, but also like performance matters in VR, right? Like frame rate is a big deal, more so for VR than it has been for anything since like early mobile. So as an engineer, especially, I'm sure that it's become a higher concern for absolutely getting stuff right, even in your prototypes. So I'd love to hear just, you know, diving into VR from the early days, from like 2010 DK1 to today. Where do you feel like that timeline has gone? Have we gotten to where we can just make junky, crunchy stuff that, because it's finally at the tech level where you don't have to be like on the hardware, or are you still very performance oriented even when doing like a prototype just for fun?
I mean, I think it's interesting because like the hardware is relatively powerful, right? Like as you start to throw quests into the equation, it becomes more challenging, definitely. Again, like, you know, a lot of the time VR is interesting because like a lot of the time performance constraints are going to be on like rendering, not on CPU, right? So like GPU cost, right? So when you're, it's weird because when you're just prototyping, you can obviously write heinous code or like do crazy shader stuff, right? When you're prototyping and tank your frame rate. But a lot of the time when you're prototyping, you're going to use like white box, you know, type things. You're just going to use primitives and stuff. So like, for example, with Luna, when I worked on Luna at Phenomena, we had a really long prototyping phase. I think it was like 3 months of pure prototyping to build out a lot of the systems in the game for VR specifically, right? Which is like unprecedented on any game project I've worked on, except maybe shadow physics, but not really. I don't think I got 3 months really to prototype shadow physics. So, because I was doing it part-time. But everything was just kind of, you know, primitive shapes, like prototype, throwaway assets, throwaway code for the most part, right? So performance didn't really come up in that phase, right? But as soon as we threw art assets at everything and had higher like bone counts and animation and had more objects in the scene, right? Suddenly then I had to start thinking about performance a lot, right? Like in the sense of some of the systems I built in prototyping were not scalable in Unity as they were, right? Like, because, you know, if I had like Luna, I mean, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Luna, but Luna has you basically have a little, I worked primarily on create mode in Luna and built a lot of the systems there. So as far as the gameplay programming that I did, so Luna, you basically have a floating diorama in front of you in VR, and you have a palette with some small objects, and you can place trees and plants in the environment on like kind of a empty environment, right? And you know, in the original prototype, it was just a white plane, and like, you know, a tree was like, you know, it was, you know, a skinned object, right? A skin mesh, but it was
Sort of
like,
like
you know,
a beautiful corner kind
yeah,
of
yeah, it
setup.
was basically just like an IK chain, like a joint chain, and like, you know, 4 pyramids or whatever, right? Like very, very basic prototype objects, right? And, you know, there were like 10 things in the scene. Cool. You know, we try and scale up and do the real version. Well, now like there's more art, there's like UI objects, there's the whole terrain, but there's also like, we wanted to do a lot more trees in the scene to actually be able to arrange it and fill it out, right? So, you know, and the way I kind of set things up is like, we started talking about ECS, right? This is a Unity technical kind of detail, but like I use components for everything, and like, you know, there are multiple game objects on like each chain, right? So you have like, so I actually had like, you know, thousands of updates, right? Which is not good for Unity, right? If you use dots, that's no problem. But if you use Unity, vanilla Unity, kind of like with an update callback, it's slow, right? So I actually ended up CPU limited in Luna at one point. And to get around that, like I kind of built my own update system, which is what a lot of people will do, right? So you have a single update and you iterate through all the objects and you kind of decide whether they're enabled or disabled or not. So there's updating a lot fewer things and not, you know, paying for the overhead of calling back into the engine every time an object would update. So yeah, that's just kind of a performance anecdote, right? But like with rendering was also an issue, right? Where like, you know, we had to turn off shadows on a bunch of objects and like rewrite some shaders to like get better performance, right? Like, so, you know, I think, well, prototyping, it's kind of easy to ignore that stuff in VR, depending on what you're prototyping. Obviously, certain things, like if you're writing a custom, you know, compute shader that was operating on, you know, 1 billion objects and like kind of using your GPU heavily, like that might be a problem. But yeah, I think even in VR, possibly even on Oculus Quest, you can kind of ignore the performance problem a little bit while prototyping. And I actually encourage people to do so, right? Like, you know, a lot of the time prototype code does become production code.
Yeah.
I don't really, you know, like I didn't with Luna, like I wrote a bunch of prototype code, kept it on my machine, never checked it in, and then refactored all the code that I wanted to reuse once I knew, and throughout all the stuff that I wasn't going to use, right?
Sure.
And in the process of refactoring, we wrote most of the code, and that's probably a better, like it doesn't always work for a lot of different reasons, but I think like if you can, treating your prototype code or even your entire prototype project as just throwaway is very helpful, because like using it to inform what you're going to build rather than using it to start what you're going to build can help reduce some pain. So you can avoid some of those performance pitfalls and other just code.
I treat all my code like it's trash, which is usually accurate.
Yeah, I mean that's healthy also. Yeah. I tend to write the trash code, the most trash code as possible that does the simplest, most straightforward thing first, just to figure out what I'm doing, and then like rewrite it multiple times as I go. So
yeah, this is why I have such a like passion and love for simulation games, because I've always said that pretty much every game I've made could be a text adventure or could be purely ASCII. Like, you know, I could make any of my games in the Dwarf Fortress sense that it's purely text, because there's all of the core gameplay is, you know, basic C or C# objects, right? It doesn't really need the rendering pipeline. And because of that, you can write just like a back end of gameplay before you have anything showing up on screen, which is kind of that for specifically like the system designs of it, not the visuals, you know, not the juice, not all the other stuff you'll want to eventually prototype. But for me, prototypes have always been that, right? The bad code just to get character on screen, so then you can do all the gameplay that you want to do and really explore.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. This is my love for prototypes. I couldn't not say something about them.
Oh, you should go ahead.
We're gonna open it up to questions now. I've asked enough, especially for the VR stuff. I'm not an expert. We have folks here that are. So for anything questions related to VR, working in the industry, getting jobs, Scott's here for y'all. So go ahead and pop those questions into Zoom, into Twitch, and I guess Mason and I will redirect them to Scott. I believe we had one from Joshua earlier, which was whether games was your first choice or goal.
In my case, yes. Even before school, I think I wanted to make video games since I was like 6 or 7 years old, right? And I started like trying to teach myself how to program at like 9 or 10, because I wanted to make video games. So I think it's just always been a passion of mine, and like I know a lot of people can't say that it's true, for a lot of different reasons, or like they kind of like decide they don't want to do it anymore for various reasons. And a lot of those reasons are good reasons. But yeah, I don't know. It's something I've always wanted to do, and like it's not something I kind of. It was definitely intentional. Like how I interact with games and what I'm doing is not necessarily so intentional, right? Like
Sure.
It's like that's why I've jumped around from AAA and to indie, back to AAA, back to indie, to tech, right? Like recently I've been doing kind of like games adjacent tech and like engine stuff, even though I've been working on game type stuff, right? Like so. But yeah, I've always kind of wanted to just be in that space. And the times I thought about just leaving entirely and being like, oh, let me just become like a back-end web engineer or something, or like get into robotics or AI or something, I'm just kind of like, do I really want to do this? I don't know. Like, so yeah.
Cool, thanks. We have a question from MJ. What do you think is the most difficult real-world interaction to recreate in VR?
There's a lot of things that it's funny because there are a lot of things like, when I first started doing VR stuff like 7 years ago or whatever, or 5 years ago, I thought were just not possible in VR, because it's like, oh, well, like, players can just kind of move their head anywhere, relatively speaking. And like if you collide with the, with the world, like it's gonna make them sick, right? But that's actually not true. Like a lot of games do some sort of, penetration checks and kind of slide the player back and move on. Like, and like I actually think like, when you look at games like Boneworks or games like Alex, especially Half-Life Alex, right? They do a lot of really complex physics interactions, and they have a lot of tricks that kind of just work in my opinion, right? Like, it's like the fact that it's okay to kind of like have the controller position, like your physical controller position in real life, be a little bit different than the visualized position, right? Like fixes a lot of problems with like putting your hands on things and hand placement, right? So, that said, I think like there's still issues with like a lot of VR games have started to rely more heavily on rigid body dynamics. Luna explicitly did not use rigid body dynamics for a lot of the interactions. Like a lot of it was like custom coded, just like spring systems or like IK or whatever, right? That was more kinematic. Because like stacking can have issues, penetration can have issues, right? And it has to be tuned in a specific way and like built in a specific way that it doesn't fall apart or jitter. And like you'll see that in a lot of VR games, right? Like I think people are getting better about it, but people still aren't quite at the point where they're building custom physics engines entirely to handle this stuff. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's things that are just hard in games in general, like ropes and doors and fluid dynamics and things like that. Ladders, exactly. That ladders actually I think work a lot better in VR than anywhere else.
Because they don't work at all in anywhere else.
So I mean the ability to actually climb in VR with your hands, and that it works pretty well, and there are like games where climbing is a core mechanic. or one of the core mechanics. You know, I think fixes a lot of things with ladders, but it's weird because, you know, I think about this question and it's like, yeah, there are a lot of things that are hard to do in general, but they actually work a lot better in VR. I guess the fact that you don't have a fully tracked body just makes certain things impossible right now. You know, I'm looking forward to the full body tracking and full facial tracking being standard, because then you get like, we'll end up with much better telepresence, and we'll end up with better body awareness and spatial awareness, I think, for players.
That's super interesting. We have a question from Joshua that says, in VR, how do you approach the challenge of different controller inputs / headset limitations? And how good of a job do you think Unity XR does at tackling that challenge?
that's a little bit of a loaded question, because like I'm not working on a XR project right now in Unity, and I don't work with the XR group, but I work at Unity. So like putting them on blast stuff is a little feels a little rough. Like if I was on that team, I'd be like, yeah, we should do this, but you know, like I think like you know, and also my Unity knowledge for XR cross-platform is a little bit outdated, because the last time I worked on a cross-platform XR Unity title was in 2017. And in that era, right, like there were multiple SDKs. I kind of had to manage them myself. So I wrote like a little cross-platform layer in Unity that could support both like kind of the Oculus ecosystem and Steam VR, right? And at that point, Steam VR was only Vive also, right? I mean, I shouldn't say it was only Vive. It was Vive and Oculus CV1, so the original Rift. But I mean, Luna shipped on a bunch of different platforms. Like it shipped on PSVR, it just shipped on Oculus Quest. And I don't know how much of that code has been rewritten or reworked, but I imagine, hopefully, I like to think I put in a system in place where like future developers could go in and kind of build on top of that system, right? So it seems like you still need a little bit of help from Unity because of the fragmentation in SDKs. OpenXR might fix some of that in the future, right? Because OpenXR is designed with, you know, various input capabilities, taking various input capabilities across VR or across XR into consideration, right? Where it's like, you know, oh yeah, if you want to support hand tracking now, you still have to mostly do it entirely as a separate thing yourself, right? But the OpenXR input system could theoretically do some mapping between both hand tracking and controller input, right? If you actually want to take advantage of hand tracking, you still have to do a hand tracked interface for your game, though. So, I mean, I think there's certain things you like, there's only so much the engine can do for you, right? And you still have to consider, you know, a wide variety of different control setups, you know, and different capabilities. And I think that'll be true in XR for quite a while. I think eventually we'll probably hit a smartphone style game console style maturity in XR, where it's like, oh, you can kind of assume all devices have the same capabilities, right? Like, but we're not there yet. And I don't think we'll be there for a while.
That's super cool. I didn't know. That makes sense. Kind of the mobile, everything kind of works the same based on just the system. So I hope VR gets there because that'd be really cool. We have another question from Mickey that is, can you talk about audio for VR? I am a sound designer very interested in researching 3D and spatial audio.
Yeah. Was there anything like any specific thing with audio, or just like general dump on spatial audio? Or general, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is like VR audio is in the same way that visuals in VR are significantly more immersive because of stereo, because of head tracking. You know, you feel like you're in a volumetric space instead of just staring at a screen, right? Audio has the same capabilities, right? So, you know, spatial audio exists on all VR devices. They there's a thing called head related transfer functions, which like if you look at the spatial audio SDKs, like all the platform holders have one, I believe. So there's like an Oculus one, and there's a Steam one, and there's like, you know, maybe some newer ones as well, support this, and it basically allows for not just spatial 3D audio, but actually looking at like considering the position of each of your ears relative to the headset, considering the like direction of your ears. Yeah. uh, so yeah, like I don't know, it's a lot more immersive. I think, like, how does it? Since I'm not an audio guy, like on Luna I did some audio programming in Wise, right? And I've done audio programming on other projects in the past. But since I'm not actually a sound designer, it's hard for me to speak exactly to the sound design perspective of it, right? And how it affects things. But, you know, at least on Luna, a lot of what was important was, you know, actually remembering to spatialize the audio, like thinking about space in general. Like even like in some cases you still want to do non-spatialized audio cues or just regular stereo audio cues, right? But in most cases you probably want the audio to be spatial in VR, right? So thinking about like where the sound comes from in all cases, like even with things that you would consider traditionally like just normal mono kind of global sounds, right? Like UI stuff, right? Like if you have a spatial UI, you might want your audio to be spatialized in the UI still, even though traditionally that wouldn't be the case. So yeah, and one interesting thing is we're starting to see spatial audio outside of capabilities outside of VR as well. Like, you know, I think AirPod Max came out recently, and you know it has spatial audio capabilities. I don't know what the SDK looks like or like what the sound setup looks like, but you can imagine a game that's an audio only game that's actually using spatialized audio, like that's designed for AirPod Max, right? That just throws out the rest of the VR aspect, but just does like spatialized audio. So I don't know. That's hopefully that was enough. If there's any other questions about audio, I can answer them. But
I've got a question for you personally, and that is kind of the general, where do you see VR going, you know, in the next 10, 20 years in terms of hardware improving or software becoming more optimized? Just kind of where do you see the general development going?
yeah, so my thought was that in 2023, so I'll start with a business case, right? Because I think one of the problems with VR recently is like, you know, players and the press like are slightly negative on it still, right? It's interesting because I actually see like a trend where it's like a lot of the time, like, you know, younger people are a lot more excited about VR than older people. Like, so there's also kind of a view of like, oh, well, as like younger people start getting into games, or like, oh, this is a cool thing, like I can do it, and they'll understand the paradigms more and stuff like that, right? But so I think there is a little bit more like, you know, it took a while for video games to mature and actually become like a mainstream thing, and now like it's taking a little bit while, not that it's been that long, but it's taking a little while for VR to mature and become a thing, right? So, but my guess, and this is, I'm just throwing it out there, is 2023 is the point where like VR will be relatively sustainable for a lot of developers. Right now, a lot of VR is still funded by big tech companies, right? And like we're starting to see in Quest where there's multiple teams that can actually release a VR game and survive on it, right? You know, I think like going forward with new hardware and things like that, that'll get better as more people jump into it. The biggest issue I see in VR actually right now is not a hardware problem or a software problem or a game engine problem or anything like that. It's not a developer facing thing. It's not hardware. It's not platform, which I wouldn't necessarily, or it's not, and it's not cost anymore, in my opinion. It's like quality and number of like games, apps, content, whatever you want to call it, right? So yeah, I think like, I for as a developer, like, or for developers in general, I think that's like, some people would say like, oh, well, VR is never going to go anywhere because of that. But I'm like, that's actually a business opportunity. If you're a game developer making a VR game that hits with people, it's like an underserved market right now.
Yeah.
Like like you have to hit a certain quality bar though, and that's not easy, right? I think that's the challenge. Where Steam VR has a lot of VR games that they're effectively like prototype projects released commercially, or like really small part-time projects, or like made by new developers, right? So I think, and I actually believe that the true bar for VR is like even higher. Like Alex, you bring up Alex, right? Like it's even higher than like AAA, right? Like gaming in the long term, right? Like, because with the mobile, you could kind of get away with like lower production values because it's a smaller screen, but with VR, like interactions are way more complicated in a lot of ways, right? Like people want like higher fidelity stuff. I guess there's a little bit of a saving grace in the sense of like, if you're talking about Quest or you're talking about standalone hardware, it's still mobile quality hardware, so you have to like, your assets aren't going to be as complex. They're still like, you know, Xbox 360 era assets, right? So you can go back on production values in that way, but people still want deeper games, right? For the most part. So I think like a lot of the growth is going to be there. But you know, if you look at the most popular VR game is not Alex, it's Beat Saber, right? So I think there's a lot of room for like building smaller, really polished things that really resonate with people in VR, even in this moment, right? Like as far as hardware goes, like there's a lot of things that I would like to see in hardware, but there's a lot of trade-offs with price and performance and stuff like that, right? I'd like to see more standalones that are good and high quality besides just Facebook's, right? Like there's if you're interested in VR, like actually looking at what Facebook is doing, and like Mark Zuckerberg gave an interview on the Information podcast that I listened to pretty recently. It came out like a week or two ago, I think, and it's really good. And it talks about like, he talks pretty openly about Facebook's strategy, right? And like they want to hit 10 million units at some point, right? And they feel like that's sustainable, which I don't know if it's true, but I still believe that I came up with that 10 million number because I was at a Facebook Oculus offsite. And I talked to someone on the growth team and I said 10 million. And then like 6 months or a year later, everyone was saying 10 million. Now, to be fair, and it got like, so to be fair, like anyone who kind of knows the industry and knows like what a sustainable level of users is for like a gaming platform could come up with that number pretty easy. It's a nice round number. It's not like, I don't really think that happened, but I still like to think to this day that like, I just talked to one person at a party one time, and then it bubbled up the chain to Mark Zuckerberg, and he's still like using that as the bar. But you know, whatever. But I think with hardware, like I mentioned full body tracking, I mentioned you know, we have hand tracking already. I mentioned facial tracking, right? I actually think that like, and we're kind of getting there with like LiDAR scanners and like iPhone and stuff like that, right? But like, and I kind of hope that maybe Apple headset, whenever that comes out in a couple of years, I guess, will push on that aspect. But I kind of think that like spatial scanning will be important. So I think Facebook is really going to focus on people and not places, and get virtual people down really well. And then like someone else, maybe Apple, maybe someone else will like focus more on places and like being able to go to other places really well, maybe Microsoft or something, I don't know. And then like eventually we'll see that kind of congeal, and like telepresence I think is probably the killer app, right? And I think gaming will be number 2, right? So like, but those things enable new things in gaming as well, right? and they can help developers build new experiences or build things more cheaply, right? And so, I think, I did talk about production values and AAA and stuff like that, right? But like, you know, you, have you all seen Epic's Meta Human Creator thing, right?
I
So
have, yeah.
I think tools like that where you can, one thing I was asked a lot, and I was asked a lot of tech people, especially like in the late kind of tens, like around, I think around when before Quest came out, like around when Vive came out or the original Rift came out, like, oh, I want to do this VR experience. How do I just like take a video of someone and like put them in the experience? And it's like, you can't really do that. Like you need to hire an artist, and you see like it's really expensive to build like even stylized humans, right? That are somewhat, you know, representative and like that someone would want to interact with, right? It's not the same as like, I guess people like the ideal for a lot of people is basically like, anyone can make a YouTube video basically, right? Or like stream on Twitch, right? You just need a camera and you're just there, right? And then, so like I think the ideal for VR is like if we can get there and do like volumetric immersive experiences and that are interactive, that's really powerful. And I think tools like that, even though I'm not supposed to necessarily like hype epic services, right? Like I think as tools like that come aboard, that'll be very powerful as well.
Yeah.
So and I also think reducing form factor and headsets lighter will help, right, with comfort and stuff. And like there's other things in optics, right? Like is anyone familiar with varifocal here? So varifocal display is basically, and it only exists in like prototypes from what I've seen. Like Oculus has demonstrated a couple research prototypes of it, but there's no consumer devices that have this, right? But varifocal is basically your eyes, change focal width naturally, right? Assuming you don't have like some sort of vision impairment, right? Like not everyone's eyes do that, right? But like many people's eyes will change focus, and you just do this naturally, subconsciously, you don't think about it, right? But all current consumer VR headsets have a fixed focal length, which is like either like 1.5 meters or 2 meters, depending, right? Like, and it's really assumed, right? So if you're focusing on something about 2 meters away, it's cool. But if you bring something really close, like you can't really focus on it in VR on existing devices, right? Which isn't a really big problem if you're building like shooters and stuff. But if you actually want to just pick up text and read it real close, it doesn't work, right? So varifocal actually in hardware will change the focal length of the lens based on you need eye tracking for this as well, right? But like based on what you're looking at, right? So you can do eye tracking, raycast, figure out what you're looking at, and then the hardware can change the focal length. And it's like amazing, right? Like it would
That's
definitely
really neat.
I think it would definitely improve comfort in that sense of like you can't, because of that and some other optical things, you can't stay in a VR headset. A lot of people can't stay in a VR headset without eye fatigue, right? And like there are thoughts that potentially if you stay in for a long time, you could have long-term damage, vision damage, right? Some people have reported that, like, and this is like not long usage over time, but like daily usage, 8 hours a day for like years at a time, right?
Yeah. It's a lot of VR.
It's a lot of VR. So hopefully like some of those things can be addressed. And if you start talking about productivity and not just gaming, like we kind of need to fix those things.
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
So I mean, that's I guess a lot of things that I'm looking forward to. There are definitely other things, right? But
that's very insightful. Thank you. We have another question from Joshua that says, with VR still in its growing phase, how do you see newcomers to the industry, like students, getting into a studio? Or should they wait until the VR boom 2.0, where AAA studios adopt the platform?
Yeah, I think there's some indie studios that will hire for VR, right? Definitely. But you know, they're limited positions, right? Yeah, like alchemy is one, definitely. Uh, uh, but they're limited positions in any indie studio, right? Like usually they'll most indie studios can only hire like one or two junior people, right? Or like new grad people, right? So um,
I would take a wild guess that there's probably also a smaller community of people interested in those roles among the students. Or is it possible that there's more students enthusiastic than there's jobs available because they're the generation growing up with it?
I think there actually might be more students enthusiastic. I think for students, it's interesting because it kind of hints at some of the stuff I was talking about with VR before. Like, I think there's still an opportunity to just make a VR game at a small scale. Like, if you just make a puzzle platformer on Steam and you could be super proud of it and it's awesome and you release it, probably no one will buy it or play it, right? Like, it's possible. Like, you could blow up and like you know there's always like a possibility or anything. But I think if you do it in VR and you actually have a good concept, there's no guarantee of success there, obviously. But like, I actually feel like if you're a student starting out a new team, you might have even one better funding opportunities, but also better um, like opportunities get noticed on the platform if you have a cool concept in VR than other platforms. I'm not like I just have a feeling about that, but uh, like yeah, I'm not sure. Like there it is a trick though that there are not many studios working in VR part time or full time. I think it's interesting because like there was a survey on I think it was IEEE. They do like a salary survey every year about software engineer surveys, and the AR VR engineer is actually the highest paid right now, and like it's like grew the most. And like I was on a thread and we were talking and people were talking about maybe why, right? And AR VR engineer, it's specifically AR/VR engineer. The title is only really used by like Facebook and Apple. So it kind of implies that you work for a big tech company. But that means like for a student, if you're at least if you're an engineer, in some cases if you're a designer, and definitely if you're a tech artist as well, you might be able to go to a tech company and work. Yeah, training some companies as well. You might be able to go to a tech company, either a startup or a big tech company, and work in VR, right? And work on game engine tech, game like applications, right? Um, uh, so I think there are opportunities there as well for students.
Awesome. Do we have any last questions or are we all wrapped up? Oh, I think we got last question here. Going once, going twice. All right. For VR, do you want to take it, Mason? You got it.
I was gonna say, yeah, I saw Mickey. For VR AR to be widely accessible and affordable for everyone, how long would it take? I am guessing maybe 10 to 15 years. What do you think, Scott?
I think less than that, depending on how you define accessibility and affordability. Like, you know, Quest 2 is pretty low or pretty low price, right? And it's, you know, it's standalone, right? So you don't really need anything else. I guess you need a smartphone to set it up initially right now, but like, um, you don't really need anything else, right? So like, I think we're at the point where the accessibility is basically the same, at least for a narrow slice of hardware, uh, as a game console is, right? So, and once again, you can argue a lot about accessibility. Game consoles, not everyone can afford a game console, right? Um, but like, you know, when you're looking at like hardware that's roughly the price of a Nintendo Switch, uh, which once again, not everyone can afford, and you start looking at like generations of that hardware being out there though, and like people picking up used hardware, etc. Right? Like it improves affordability. Like I think it'll happen a lot faster than 10 or 15 years. I think like there's two parts of that question though, because there's accessibility and affordability, but there's also like at what point does the value proposition actually make sense, right? Like, any, I'm not going to say most people, I'm going to say almost anyone, unless you just love Beat Saber, right? Almost anyone, or love like a set of VR games or a specific VR game, right? Like Rec Room or something, right? Almost anyone will get more value out of a Nintendo Switch, including myself, and I love VR, than Oculus Quest, right? Right now, right? Just because there's way more content, there's way more stuff to do. So there's a, but the cost is still the same, right? So if you weigh that equation, right, and you're like, well, I could afford either one technically, but I'm gonna get way more value out of this one, and I can just get one, so I'm just gonna get one. So there is a tipping point where like there's enough value in VR where people decide to go with the VR headset instead, and that might be 10 or 15 years out, definitely. But like, you know, I want to say like in 5 years, it will get to the point where like someone who, you know, can afford a console or two would look at like just getting a VR headset, a standalone VR headset, and get enough value out of, you know, the titles on there that they, or whatever is on there that they're doing, that they might, you know, consider it like worth their money, right? You know, and that's assuming, once again, like a $200 to $400 price point there, right? Like, I don't know if PC VR will ever really be affordable, right? But you know, I think there is an access where like standalone and maybe console like PSVR 2 or something could start looking more affordable for a lot more people, and also be a pretty good value proposition in a shorter time frame than 10 to 15 years. Might be closer to 10 years, but than 5 years. But yeah, I don't think, I think 15 years out, like there'll be no question of like where VR stands kind of in a lot of people's life, and like what the value proposition is.
Awesome. I think that wraps it for us. I know you got to get going soon.
Yeah.
Thanks again for hanging out with us. I'm sure all the students appreciate it. A lot of good insights here. And maybe someday we'll see you in person again at a GEC,
Hopefully.
or, you know, get you out here for a VR Austin Jam again someday.
Yeah, hopefully. All right, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
I hope you all enjoyed it. You know, I hope it was informative. But, yeah.
I certainly learned a lot. So thank you very much. Thank y'all for coming too. I guess I'll go ahead and end the meeting then. Thanks y'all. Have a good rest of your days,
Good day.
and we'll talk soon.